It was 8:46 in the morning.
And then we heard a plane come over, and in Manhattan, you don't hear planes too often, especially loud ones.
Right then and there, morning to your ordinary office until a plane struck the North Tower at around 8:46 in the morning. The plane severed all three stairwells, escaping the North Tower, leaving practically everybody above the impact zone stuck. The president at the time was down in Florida reading to some elementary school kids when an office aide informed her about what just recently happened, forcing her to promptly cancel all trips and go back to Washington. However, just as he receives word, another aircraft turns off its transporter and takes a heading back east, the destination, New York City. Approximately 15 minutes later, Flight 175 crashes into the South Tower. At approximately 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 from American Airlines hits the South Tower of New York. And back in Florida, the president was about to read a children's book when the head of state just came in and warned him that a second plane has crashed into the South Tower. Being alarmed by this, President Bush decided to continue with the lesson and schedule a press conference after he was done, which he did so at 9:30 a.m. But by then, both towers were in flames. Smoke from the towers was visible enough that it was even seen in outer space by NASA. And just as the FAA deduced that the planes were deliberately crashed into the Twin Towers, they came too late, as the two other planes became hijacked, both of them loaded with passengers. On the one hand, Flight 77 left Washington, D.C. at 8:20 this morning with 53 passengers, only to stop mid-flight and turn back to Arlington, Virginia, and it crashed onto the other side of the Pentagon. Before Flight 77's crash on the Pentagon, the FAA ordered all aircraft to land immediately. All impending flights were grounded, and all international flights were diverted to either Mexico or Canada. The latter soon closing its doors due to its airports being overfilled with international flights destined for the U.S. And the bridges and tunnels leading to and from New York were closed for the day until further notice. And while all hell's breaking loose down below, Flight 93 was just passing its way out of Pennsylvania when the FAA's ordered all civilian aircraft to land immediately. And minutes later after that happened, a group of hijackers stormed the cockpit and supposedly killed the two pilots. However, what the hijackers did not know was that their entry and hostage scene was recorded by traffic controllers down in Cleveland. While the president was on his way to Washington, a few Secret Service agents just found out that Flight 77 was either aiming for the Pentagon or the White House, and that they have to evacuate immediately. And since they were hostile, they refused to set up negotiations with them. Meanwhile, Flight 93 changes direction in Ohio and goes straight to Washington, just like Flight 77. With two planes heading towards Washington, the Secret Service had to evacuate the Capitol and White House immediately. However, 2 minutes after the evacuation of the White House taking effect, Flight 77 crashes into the Pentagon. Despite the section of the Pentagon being fairly renovated and unoccupied, 189 people were dead that day in the Pentagon, including 64 passengers and 125 Pentagon personnel. And with the frenzy of the White House evacuation, the Secret Service, nor the President on Air Force One heard of the Pentagon crash until he landed. By 9:45, the White House and Capitol were successfully evacuated and closed. At the same time, the FAA ordered all U.S. airspace to be shut down. No aircraft was allowed to take off or land. Any international flights in the U.S. or out of the U.S. were redirected to either Canada or Mexico. At around the same time where this is going, Flight 93 people are being held hostage by the hijackers with a message saying that this is your captain speaking. We have a bomb on board. We're going back to the airport. We have our demands, so please remain quiet. And by then, people are beginning to become aware of what happened at the World Trade Center and at the Pentagon. By then, AP reports that the planes used to crash into the Twin Towers were apparently Flight 11 and 175, one from United and one from American Airlines, both of them which departed from Boston and headed for Los Angeles. Air Force One at the time was stuck in the air for about 40 minutes with the pilots discussing where they should land, completely unaware of what's happening inside Flight 93 or what's going to happen over at New York.
Back, sir.
By the time the South Tower collapsed, the passengers in Flight 93 were unaware, but they decided to storm the cockpit and take back control of the plane, while the hijackers prevented that and started stabbing multiple passengers. The hijackers eventually decided that they are going to intentionally crash the plane before the passengers take control of it again. And so, at 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 crashed in a nosedive position in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing all people on board at 583 miles an hour. And many people believe that Flight 93's target was either the Capitol or the White House, both of which were evacuated down in Washington. A few of the locals actually saw a big cloud of smoke where the plane crashed and decided to see it for themselves, and all they found was a horrible heap of wreckage and bodies littered down the field. After seeing the collapse of the South Tower in the United Nations, the entire complex had to be evacuated due to potential fears that it was going to be another target for the terrorists to crash the plane in. The fear that many people had made them think that there were other potential targets, especially down at the West Coast. For one, the U.S. Bank Tower in Los Angeles would have been a potential target for an airplane crash, causing a 9/11 in Los Angeles. While down south in Orange County, Disneyland has been shut down for the second time since JFK's assassination back in 1963, and due to potential fears that a plane will crash right into the castle in the center of Main Street. The September 11 attacks are the worst terrorist attacks in history and the deadliest foreign attack in U.S. soil since the attack on Pearl Harbor 60 years ago back in 1941. 3,000 people were killed, including 19 hijackers, and more than 6,000 are wounded or missing. 2,600 people died at the Twin Towers, an additional 125 people at the Pentagon, and also including 340 firefighters, 72 police officers, and 55 military personnel who died in the attacks. 90% of the people who died at the Twin Towers were at or above the point of impact, and an estimated 200 fell or jumped to their deaths in both towers, along with 1,355 people in the North Tower, along with 630 people in the South Tower, which is actually fewer than half from the North. However, because of all the disassembled human remains found at all sites of terrorist attacks, only 1,640 people were identified for now. Many people claim that the destruction of the city, it looked a lot more like a war zone, like a zone from a post-apocalyptic world. Many rescue operations took place for all people trapped under the rubble. However, due to inconsistencies with searches, only 12 survivors were pulled out of the rubble alive. The aftermath of the attacks came very soon thereafter. To start, Congress passed the Patriot Act and created a Department of Homeland Security bound to late 2001-2002. Also around the same time, President Bush made troops invade Afghanistan and initiated the War on Terror. There were hate crimes on Muslims. The military set up operations in Guantanamo Bay down in Cuba. Wall Street was shut down, leading to a decrease in the global economy. And memorials were soon erected in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and also down New York City at Ground Zero. And every year they hold a tribute of light where they dedicate a day of September 11th to the 2,900 victims, not including terrorists, that died in the attacks. The Freedom Tower, also known as the new Twin Tower, is painted in the American colors to never forget what happened 15 years ago. Those who died always get their names read every year in New York City, along with deserving moment of silence declared by the President to observe Patriot Day, which was created shortly after. And I would like to recite a poem entitled The Names from the author Billy Collins, which is dedicated to all the victims of 9/11. Yesterday, I lay awake in the palm of the night. The soft rain stole in, unhelped by any breeze, and when I saw the silver glaze on the windows, I started with A, with Ackerman, as it happened, then Baxter, and Calabro, Davis, and Eberling, names falling into place as droplets fell through the dark, names printed on the ceiling of the night, names slipping around a watery bend, 26 willows on the banks of a stream. In the morning, I walked out barefoot among thousands of flowers, heavy with dew like the eyes of tears, and each had a name, Fiore inscribed on a yellow petal, and then Gonzalez, and Han, Ishikawa, and Jenkins, names written in the air and stitched into the cloth of the day. A name under a photograph taped to a mailbox, monogram on a torn shirt. I see you spelled out on storefront windows, and on the bright unfurled awnings of the city. I say the syllables as I turn a corner. Kelly and Lee, Medina, Nardella, and O'Connor. When I peer into the woods, I see a thick tangle where letters are hidden, as in a puzzle concocted for children. Parker and Quigley in the twigs of an ash, Rizzo, Schubert, Torres, and Upton, secrets in the boughs of an ancient maple, names written in the pale sky, names rising in the updraft amid buildings, names silent in stone or cried out behind a door, names blown over the earth and out to sea. In the evening, weakening light, the last shadows. A boy on a lake lifts his oars. A woman by a window puts a match to a kettle. candle, and the names are outlined on rose clouds, Vanacore, and Wallace, and let X stand, if it can, for the ones unfound, and then Young and Zeminski, the final jolt of Z. Names etched on the head of a pin. A name spanning the badge, another undergoing a tunnel. A blue name needled to the skin. Names of citizens, workers, mothers, and fathers. The bright-eyed daughter, the quick son. Alphabet of names in a green field. Names in the small tracks of birds. Names lifted from a hat, or balanced on the tip of the tongue. Names wheeled to the dim warehouse of scenery, or memory. So many names, there's barely room on the walls of the heart.